Amid the fog of the 12th century, when the Christian world still stood on pillars of faith and medieval traditions, an extraordinary figure emerged in the heart of Germany. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, a woman of profound spirituality and vision, was not just a Benedictine nun. She was also a mystic, composer, poet, naturalist, and self-taught physician. Her name would echo through the centuries as a witness to a life shaped by faith and the extraordinary gifts granted by God. Born in 1098 in Bermersheim, Hildegard was the 10th child of a noble family. Her parents, in a gesture of devotion common at the time, decided to offer her to the church when she was just 8 years old. Under the care of Jutta of Sponheim, a noblewoman living in seclusion in a Benedictine monastery, young Hildegard began to chart the path that would lead her to become one of the most influential figures in medieval Christian spirituality. From childhood, the future saint experienced mystical visions. They were so intense and clear that, initially, she believed all people also had such experiences. However, time would reveal that Hildegard was different. The visions she received were not common but rather divine gifts, messages sent directly by God. These revelations became, throughout her life, a central point of her mission and legacy. As she grew under Jutta's guidance, the young girl began to develop a vast range of knowledge, from studying the scriptures to music and natural medicine. Although she had fragile health, her spirit was vigorous and tireless. At the age of 15, Hildegard decided to take her vows and enter monastic life permanently. Thus, she began a journey of deep dedication to the Lord. Life in the monastery helped her to intellectually flourish. Often, in the rush of daily life, we Catholics end up neglecting prayer, even though we know how important it is for our spiritual life. With this in mind, we at the Sanctus channel have created an ebook called Prayer Routine for Catholics. In it, we share simple and effective ways to integrate prayer into your daily life, bringing more serenity and closeness to God. This material is a valuable companion for those who wish to live their faith more intensely and consistently. The link to the ebook is in the first comment of this video. Click on the link and get your ebook now. May God bless you. But it also deepened her spiritual life. She soon stood out among the Benedictine sisters for her intelligence and serene character, which led her in 1136 to be elected abbess of the community. However, even holding a leadership position, Hildegard never boasted. Her humility prevented her from exalting herself, and she always considered her gifts as a blessing to serve God and the Church. Although she remained discreet for many years, her visions continued to grow in intensity and clarity. At the age of 42, the abbess had an experience that would change the course of her life. In one of those visions, she heard a divine voice ordering her to write down everything that was being revealed to her. Initially, Hildegard resisted. She feared that by writing about her visions, she might be making a mistake or being pretentious. However, her resistance was overcome by obedience and encouragement from her confessor, who recognized the authenticity of her experiences. Under spiritual guidance, Hildegard began to record her visions in what would become one of her most famous works. The Civias, abbreviation of Cito Vias Domini, Know the Ways of the Lord. This book would be the first in a series of mystical writings that would profoundly influence Christian theology and spirituality. The Civias consists of 26 detailed visions that reveal the divine plan for creation, the fall of man, redemption through Christ, and the final victory over evil. These visions were accompanied by profound theological interpretations, as well as vivid descriptions that, for many, evoked the greatness and majesty of God. The work was widely recognized in her time, and Hildegard came to be consulted by bishops, kings, and even the Pope. The mystic of Bingen also received a series of revelations that inspired her to compose liturgical music. Her compositions, full of beauty and spiritual elevation, were unusual for the time. Hildegard's music, known as Symphoniae Harmoniae Celestium Revelationum, Symphonies of the Harmony of Celestial Revelations, is a testimony to her deep love for creation and for God. Each note seemed to carry a fragment of heaven, a sung prayer that rose like incense to the heavens. In addition to her theological and musical works, Saint Hildegard dedicated herself to studying plants, stones, and their possible medicinal uses. She wrote treatises on natural healing that were innovative for the time. Hildegard believed that health was the result of a harmonious balance between body, soul, and creation. In her works on medicine, such as the Physica and Causae et Curae, she shows vast knowledge of natural remedies, making her one of the pioneers of holistic medicine. Her understanding of the human body and nature was shaped by a deeply Christian vision. For Hildegard, creation was a manifestation of God's wisdom, and therefore caring for health was also an act of praise to the Creator. Her observations on plants, minerals, and the human body were studied for centuries and continue to be admired, especially in the field of natural medicine. Another fascinating aspect of this saint's life was her boldness in communicating directly with powerful leaders of her time. Despite being a woman in an era when the female voice was often silenced, Hildegard wrote letters to kings, emperors, and popes. She did not hesitate to confront corruption and lack of morality within the church itself and at royal courts, always with a frankness and courage that surprised her interlocutors. In one of her most famous letters, addressed to Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Hildegard warned him against the abuse of power and unnecessary violence in his military campaigns. Her words were sharp as swords, yet at the same time filled with deep Christian charity. Her moral authority was so great that her advice could not be easily ignored. As the years went by, the recognition of her holiness and wisdom spread throughout Europe. Men and women, rich and poor, sought her out for spiritual guidance. The humility with which she dealt with her own visions and the discernment she showed in advising others made her a light amid the spiritual darkness that sometimes enveloped the medieval world. Hildegarda, however, did not limit herself to the confines of her monastery. In a courageous and unusual act for the time, she made several trips across Germany, preaching public sermons. Her preaching, aimed at both clergy and laity, spoke of the need for reform in the Church, of God's love, and of the importance of a virtuous life. These missionary journeys made her even more well-known and respected throughout Christendom. The courageous Benedictine always emphasized the importance of harmony between nature, humanity, and God. For her, sin was not just an offense against the Creator, but also a disorder that disturbed the balance of creation. Her theology, deeply rooted in the Catholic tradition, presented an integrated vision of the cosmos, where everything was interconnected and dependent on divine will. Saint Hildegard was also a great advocate for human dignity, especially for women. In a society where women were often relegated to secondary roles, she elevated the importance of the female presence in the Church and in spiritual life. Her works highlight the role of the Virgin Mary as the ultimate example of collaboration between God and humanity, emphasizing that salvation came to the world through a woman. Her mystical vision also included images of a luminous church, adorned with virtues and led by divine wisdom. Hildegard firmly believed that the Church was the bride of Christ, called to live in holiness and purity. When she saw signs of decay or corruption, she did not hesitate to call ecclesiastical leaders to accountability. This fidelity to truth and the gospel was a striking characteristic of her mission. In her later years, Hildegard's health began to decline. However, even with a weakened body, her mind remained sharp, and her soul continued to receive divine illuminations. Until her last days, the saint dedicated herself to writing, prayer, and spiritual counseling. On September 17, 1179, Hildegard of Bingen, after a life filled with accomplishments, departed for the Father's house. Her death was accompanied by reports of signs and wonders, a final testimony of her holiness. She was buried in her monastery, where her sisters continued to honor her memory and spread her teachings. However, her legacy was just beginning. In the following centuries, the Church would increasingly recognize the depth of her theological, spiritual, and scientific contributions. Although her official canonization only took place in 2012, when Pope Benedict XVI declared her a saint and doctor of the Church, her impact on the history of Christianity has been felt since the moment of her death. Saint Hildegard is today remembered as one of the greatest mystics in the history of the Church. Her love for truth, her courage in the face of adversity, and her deep understanding of God's plan for humanity continue to inspire millions of believers around the world. Looking at her life, we are challenged to live our faith more intensely and to seek, like her, a life in deep communion with the Lord and His creation. The life of this extraordinary saint is an invitation for all of us. She teaches us that, regardless of the limitations we face, God's call can transform our weaknesses into powerful instruments for His glory. Like Hildegard, we are called to be light amid darkness, to proclaim the truth with courage, and to trust in the power of divine grace. The impact of Saint Hildegard of Bingen goes beyond what can be expressed in words. Her life is an example of how God's grace can manifest in unexpected ways, especially in difficult times. The Middle Ages, often viewed as a period of darkness and superstition, were illuminated by people like her, who brought the light of Christ into the world through their wisdom and virtue. Hildegard showed that even amid the austerity of the monastery, it was possible to transform the world around her. Another fascinating aspect of this saint's life was her understanding of cosmic harmony. For her, all of creation was interconnected in a kind of divine symphony, where each being, from the smallest insect to the stars in the sky, played a role in God's work. This vision profoundly influenced her writings, both theological and scientific. Hildegard believed that diseases were often caused by a rupture of this harmony, and that healing, both physical and spiritual, involved restoring balance. In her visions, the Benedictine mystics saw the cosmos as an expression of God's beauty and wisdom. Often, in the rush of daily life, we Catholics end up neglecting prayer, even though we know how important it is for our spiritual life. With this in mind, we at the Sanctus channel have created an ebook called Prayer Routine for Catholics. In it, we share simple and effective ways to integrate prayer into your daily life, bringing more serenity and closeness to God. This material is a valuable companion for those who wish to live their faith more intensely and consistently. The link to the ebook is in the first comment of this video. Click on the link and get your ebook now. May God bless you. She described scenes of impressive symbolic richness, where lights, colors, and shapes revealed deep truths about creation and the Creator. These descriptions served as inspiration not only for her contemporaries, but also for later generations, who saw in her a prophetic vision of how science and faith could walk together. Saint Hildegard also approached the issue of virtue in an innovative way for her time. In a society marked by wars and territorial disputes, she spoke about the need to cultivate virtues, not only in the heart, but also in everyday actions. For Hildegard, virtue was a direct response to God's love, and cultivating virtue led to true happiness. She saw the Christian life as a journey of purification, in which the faithful were constantly invited to leave sin behind and embrace the light. One of her main concerns was the corruption she saw both in society and within the Church itself. She did not hesitate to denounce deviations and to call for a deep reform that began in the heart of each Christian. In doing so, she demonstrated herself to be a true defender of moral and spiritual integrity. Her letters and sermons often reminded leaders that there was no greater service to God than the pursuit of justice and holiness. Additionally, Hildegard had a very clear view of the responsibility of spiritual leaders. She believed that those in positions of authority, especially in the Church, should be examples of virtue and truth. This conviction led her to confront the clergy of her time, even warning bishops and abbots who did not live according to their vows. Although she might be seen as a severe critic, her intention was always the good of the Church and the salvation of souls. Hildegard's boldness in defending truth and justice was not merely a product of her strong personality, but of her deep communion with God. She saw herself as a little servant, an instrument in the hands of the Creator, and everything she did was driven by this certainty. In her visions, Hildegard constantly felt supported by divine light, which guided her in her decisions and strengthened her in moments of great difficulty. The visions that Saint Hildegard received were accompanied by an intense physical experience. In her descriptions, she spoke of a living light that invaded her soul and body, providing her with knowledge that transcended human reason. Despite this, the saint never exalted herself because of her mystical experiences, always maintaining a posture of humility. She knew that everything came from God, and that her mission was simply to be a faithful messenger. Her humility, however, did not prevent her from being firm when necessary. In many of her letters, she urged the faithful to live a life consistent with the gospel. She spoke of the importance of penance, prayer, and charity as ways to grow in holiness. For Hildegard, the Christian life was not an easy journey, but a constant struggle against the temptations and seductions of the world. However, she also assured that God's grace was always available to those who turned to Him sincerely. The Church's recognition of Hildegard's visions was a significant milestone in her life. Pope Eugene III, after a careful investigation, gave his approval to the saint's mystical writings. This brought great relief to Hildegard, who often feared she was being deceived by her experiences. The papal approval was a confirmation that her visions were indeed inspired by God, and it gave her the confidence necessary to continue her work. Even after this official recognition, Hildegard continued to face challenges. The Disibodenberg monastery, where she lived, began to feel small for her needs and for the growing number of sisters who wished to join under her leadership. With a bold vision, Hildegard decided to found a new monastery in Rupertsberg, near Bingen, a place that would later become the center of her activities. The founding of the Rupertsberg monastery was an arduous task. She faced opposition from her superiors, who did not want to lose control over the Benedictine community. But with her determination and unwavering faith, Hildegard managed to establish the new monastery, where she could live more independently and continue her spiritual and intellectual work. This space became a center of knowledge, where the sisters not only prayed, but also studied and deepened their understanding of the natural sciences. The new monastery was also a reflection of Hildegard's vision of religious life. For her, the monastery should be a place of harmony, where prayer, study, and manual work were balanced. She believed that by living this way, the sisters could reflect the divine order present in creation. The community she led became an example of monastic life, attracting women from all over Europe. A central point in Hildegard's thought was the vision of Christ as the bridegroom of the Church. In her visions, she often described the intimate relationship between Christ and His Church as a nuptial union. This image, also present in the writings of the early Church Fathers, was for Hildegard a way to illustrate the deep love and care that God has for His people. The Church, as the bride of Christ, was called to be pure, faithful, and full of virtues. The German mystic is also known for her prophetic letters, in which she conveyed divine messages to rulers and ecclesiastical leaders. These letters, often harsh, were filled with warnings about the need for repentance and reform. Hildegard did not shy away from earthly power, believing that her authority came directly from God. Her courage and firmness in dealing with the powerful showed her total confidence in the mission entrusted to her. In the field of music, her compositions continue to be a treasure of Christian spirituality. The originality and beauty of her melodies, combined with profound liturgical texts, made her music true sung prayers. The Ordo Virtutum, one of her best-known works, is a kind of medieval opera that deals with the struggle of virtues against evil. This musical drama is an expression of Hildegard's understanding of the spiritual battle waged within the human soul. The life of Saint Hildegard is marked by a mystical spirituality that transcends the limits of time. Her visions, writings, and compositions reveal a soul deeply rooted in the mystery of God and committed to the good of the Church. Even centuries after her death, the influence of Saint Hildegard remains alive. Her works are still studied, both by theologians and scholars from various fields, such as music, medicine, and philosophy. She shows us that holiness and intellect are not separate. On the contrary, her life is a demonstration of how the pursuit of truth, in any area of knowledge, can be a way to glorify God. Hildegard's strength lay in her unwavering fidelity to the mission entrusted to her by God. Her visions, as extraordinary as they were, did not distance her from the concrete reality of her time. She knew that divine revelation required a practical response, and thus she dedicated herself to serving the Church and caring for souls, often leaving the comfort of monastic life to preach and counsel personally. It is impressive how, in a time when women had no voice in the public arena, Hildegard managed to make herself heard. Her letters and sermons were respected and considered by some of the most powerful men in Europe. She stood out in a world dominated by clerics and warriors, imposing herself not by force, but by wisdom and holiness. Her example reminds us that true authority comes from God and is manifested in those who are faithful to His will. Throughout her life, the saint wrote extensively about the relationship between body and soul. In her medical treatises, she sought to understand how physical and spiritual diseases were connected. For Hildegard, sin had consequences not only spiritually, but also physically, and healing involved a purification of both body and soul. She recognized the interdependence between spiritual health and physical well-being, a view that, in a sense, anticipated the principles of modern medicine. Hildegard also had a surprisingly ecological view for her time. For her, the natural world was not something to be dominated or exploited, but a creation of God that should be respected and cared for. She wrote about the balance of nature and the role of humanity as guardians of creation. In her visions, she saw the cosmos as a vast symphony, where every creature had its place in the divine work. This awareness of the interconnectedness of all living beings resonates strongly in today's ecological discussions. However, the German saint also believed that this cosmic balance was constantly threatened by sin. She saw evil as a destabilizing force, capable of corrupting not only the human soul but all of creation. For Hildegard, redemption in Christ was the only way to restore original harmony. Her thought reflects classical Christian theology, which sees in Jesus Christ the restorer of the order lost through Adam's sin. Another striking characteristic of Hildegard was her ability to synthesize the spiritual and scientific knowledge of her time. She did not see conflict between faith and reason, but believed that both complemented each other. Her works on medicine and natural sciences are imbued with a spiritual understanding of the world, showing that, for her, all created things reflect divine wisdom. This integrated perspective was rare in a time when scientific knowledge was still in its infancy. Her passion for music also reveals a soul deeply attuned to the beauty of the Creator. For Hildegard, music was a way to participate in heavenly harmony. She believed that singing, especially in the liturgical context, uniquely elevated the soul to God. Her musical output is vast and varied, including hymns, antiphons, and sequences, all intended to glorify God. The impact of her music was so great that, even today, her compositions are performed in monasteries and cathedrals around the world. The originality of Hildegard's compositions, both in melodic and lyrical terms, reveals a rare creativity. Her works not only follow the musical traditions of the time, but also present innovations that make them unique. She used wide melodic intervals and modes that gave an ethereal and mystical atmosphere to her pieces. Additionally, the texts of her songs were filled with deep theological imagery, reflecting her mystical visions. Over the centuries, her fame grew, and her life inspired numerous studies and biographies. Despite living in a medieval era, her ideas about nature, health, and spiritual life continue to resonate strongly in our contemporary society. Saint Hildegard was a woman far ahead of her time, and her legacy invites us to integrate faith, science, and spirituality into our lives. During the Renaissance, Her writings on natural medicine and healing practices were rediscovered and gained new relevance. At the same time, her musical compositions began to be appreciated by musicologists, who saw her as one of the pioneers of Western sacred music. This renewed interest in her works made her increasingly recognized as a key figure in the history of the Church and Western culture. The canonization process of Saint Hildegard was long and complex. Although her holiness was recognized almost immediately after her death, her official canonization only took place in 2012 by Pope Benedict XVI. The delay was partly due to the vast amount of writings and visions that needed to be carefully analyzed by the Church. However, her holiness was never questioned by the faithful, who always venerated her as a powerful intercessor. The title of Doctor of the Church, granted to her in the same year of her canonization, is one of the highest honors the Church can bestow on a saint. This title is reserved for those who, in addition to their holiness, have also left a significant theological or doctrinal legacy for the Christian faith. Hildegard joined figures like St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Teresa of Avila, being one of the few women to receive this title. Hildegard's appointment as Doctor of the Church was not only a recognition of her theological writings, but also an affirmation of the relevance of her thought for the modern world. Her visions on creation, ecology, health, and spirituality continue to offer profound insights for the challenges we face today. The saint's wisdom reminds us that the path to God passes through caring for our neighbor and the world around us. Looking at the life and work of Saint Hildegard, we see the example of a woman who, despite the limitations imposed by her time, was able to profoundly influence the history of the Church and Western thought. She shows us that true holiness is not limited to interior life, but is expressed in active commitment to the world, in the pursuit of justice, truth, and beauty. Her life was, in many respects, a foreshadowing of what the Church would become in the following centuries. Hildegard was a visionary, both spiritually and intellectually, and her example continues to illuminate the path for those seeking to live an authentic faith engaged with the issues of our time. Devotion to Saint Hildegard has grown substantially in recent times, with many pilgrims visiting the Rupertsberg Monastery in search of inspiration and intercession. Her life is seen as a testimony to how holiness and wisdom can transform the world. The strength of her message, which unites spirituality, science, and art, continues to touch the hearts of millions of believers around the globe. Hildegard's spirituality was rooted in the Benedictine tradition, which values the balance between prayer, work, and study. This balance permeates her entire life and work. She saw prayer as the center of everything, but recognized that knowledge and work were ways to praise God and contribute to the good of humanity. Thus, her legacy is also a call for us to integrate these dimensions into our own lives. Throughout her life, Saint Hildegard had a profound influence on those around her. The sisters of her monastery saw her as a spiritual mother, and her community flourished under her leadership. She inspired not only the women of her time but also men, who often sought her advice on spiritual and moral issues. Hildegard's example teaches us that God can act in unexpected ways. She was not born into a position of power or influence, and her fragile health could have been an obstacle to achieving so much. However, it was precisely in her weakness that God showed his strength. As we look at the trajectory of Saint Hildegard of Bingen, we realize that her physical weakness was never an impediment for God's grace to flourish in her life. She transformed her limitations into strengths and used her gifts for the edification of the Church and the propagation of the truth. Hildegard reminds us that God does not choose the strongest or most influential, but the humble, those willing to hear his voice and follow his call faithfully. The impact of her visions and mystical writings transcends the boundaries of her time. Through her intense communion with God, she captured aspects of divine truth that continue to illuminate the path of many believers today. Hildegard did not limit herself to mere theological concepts, but lived the experience of God so profoundly that her words and actions transformed those around her. The German saint always sought harmony between body and soul, between the natural world and the spiritual. At a time when many viewed matter and the body as inferior or sinful, Hildegard offered an integrated vision, where all of creation reflected divine goodness. For her, the human body was a temple, and caring for physical health was part of the spiritual journey. Her deep understanding of human nature makes her a precursor to the holistic approaches that resonate so much today. Additionally, her love for music revealed a soul constantly seeking to express the beauty of God. For Hildegard, music was more than art. It was a prayer that elevated the spirit and united the soul to the Creator. Her compositions, many of which are still heard and sung in churches around the world, are an immortal legacy of her devotion and her connection with the divine. Music, for her, was an echo of celestial harmonies. Reflecting on her life, we are invited to a life of balance, virtue, and deep trust in divine providence. Hildegard's courage in confronting the powerful of her time and denouncing injustices, both inside and outside the church, is an example that strongly resonates today. Her zeal for truth, her humility, and her love for the church make her a model of holiness for modern times. Her relationship with Pope Eugene III and other church leaders also reveals her capacity for dialogue and respect for ecclesiastical authorities, while remaining firm in her convictions. Hildegard never ceased to be obedient to the church, but she also did not hesitate to point out when she saw the need for reform and conversion. She teaches us that love for the church also implies the desire to see it ever more holy and pure, faithful to the gospel of Christ. As we are touched by her story, we are called to apply her lessons in our own lives. Holiness, as Hildegard showed us, is not something reserved for a few, but is a universal calling. All of us, regardless of our condition, are called to live in intimate communion with God, to seek the truth with courage, and to serve our neighbor with generosity. Today, Saint Hildegard of Bingen continues to inspire not only Christians, but also people from different spiritual traditions who recognize the depth of her wisdom and her holistic view of life. Her legacy is a bridge between spirituality and science, between mysticism and rationalism, showing that the pursuit of truth must always be open to all dimensions of existence. May the life of Saint Hildegard inspire us to be faithful to our vocation, whatever it may be. May we learn from her example to be courageous in defending the truth, to dedicate ourselves to prayer, and to cultivate virtue in all areas of our lives. Her life is proof that God's grace can transform any situation, and that when we are faithful to His will, there are no limits to what we can accomplish. This extraordinary saint and doctor of the Church, with her courage, wisdom, and profound faith, teaches us that true strength comes from God, and that, regardless of circumstances, we can be instruments of transformation in the world. May her intercession continue to guide us and inspire us to seek God's glory in all that we do. Saint Hildegard of Bingen, pray for us.